Welcome to Moth and Moonlight. Get comfortable. Take a breath. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. There's no rush. It doesn't need to end. All you need to do is close your eyes and let the words wash over you like warm water, carrying you gently down into sleep. The story is called The Keeper of Lost Things. Part 1. The Cottage. Once, at the very edge of a forest that had no name on any map, there was a small stone cottage with one lit window. The cottage was old, older than the road that wound past it, older than the village 3 miles away, older perhaps than the forest itself, though the forest would dispute this. Its walls were thick and grey, softened by decades of moss and ivy, and its roof was the colour of winter, almost like a winter sky just before snow. Inside, every surface told a story. Shelves lined all 4 walls, from floor to ceiling, and on the shelves stood glass jars of every size, some no bigger than a thimble, some large enough to hold a small lantern. Inside the jars were objects, small objects, quiet objects, the kinds of things that fall from pockets and are never found again. A button, bone white, 4 holes, the thread still attached at the centre, as though it had been pulled rather than cut. A folded piece of paper, the handwriting inside so small it could only be read with the right kind of light. A key that opened nothing, or nothing that could be found. A child's drawing of a house, with smoke coming from the chimney. A single earring, blue enamel, the shape of a crescent moon. The woman who lived there was called Maren. She was not old, not exactly, though she had the kind of face that had always looked the same, as though she had been born already acquainted with patience. Her hair was dark and loose. Her hands were careful and unhurried. She moved through the cottage the way water moves through a familiar landscape, without effort, without doubt, knowing every turn. She had lived there alone for as long as anyone in the village could remember, though no one in the village thought about her very often. She came to market on Thursdays. She nodded. She paid an exact change. She walked back up the road to the forest's edge without looking back. What the village did not know, what nobody knew really except Maren herself, was that the cottage was not entirely silent at night. After dark, when the fire had burned low and the single lamp cast shadows across the shelves, the jars would begin, very faintly, to glow. Not brightly, not the way lantern glows or a candle, more like the way water catches light at a certain angle, a soft inner luminescence, a suggestion of light rather than light itself. Maren believed, and she had believed this for so long that it had passed into belief, something closer to knowledge, that objects remembered. Not in the way minds remember, with images and words, but in the way the body remembers, as warmth, as weight, as the faint impression of a hand that once held them. The button remembered a coat. The key remembered a door. The drawing remembered a child who had pressed their whole small body into the making of it. Tongue caught between teeth, orange crayon gripped tight. She did not think of herself as their keeper exactly, more as their company, someone to sit with them in the dark so they were not alone in their remembering. On the night our story begins, it was late October. The fire had burned to embers. The lamp was low. Outside, the wind moved through the forest in long, slow waves, and the branches of the oak tree near the eastern wall tapped against the stones in a rhythm that Maren had long ago stopped noticing. She was sitting by her chair, a cup of something warm held in both hands, watching the jars. They were glowing tonight, all of them, faintly, as though the objects inside were restless, as though something was coming. Then a sound she had not expected, a knock at the door. Maren set down her cup. She was not afraid. Fear required a certain investment in outcomes, and Maren had long since loosened her grip on outcomes. She was simply curious. Visitors did not come to the cottage, not at this hour, not on nights like this, when the wind was up and the road was dark, and the forest was doing its quiet, enormous breathing. She went to the door and opened it. The wind came in first, cool and leaf-scented, carrying with it the smell of something that might have been wood smoke from far away. The road outside was empty. The trees moved quickly and darkly behind. The moon, nearly full, laid a long, pale stripe across the doorstep. And there, at the very centre of that stripe, sat a moth. It was larger than most moths, though not improbably slow. Its wings were closed, held together like hands pressed in patient thought, and their colour was exactly the colour of old paper, or new ash, or the sky in those last moments before dawn, when the dark is just beginning to consider letting go. It sat very still. It did not seem frightened. Maren looked at it for a long moment. In her experience, and she had a particular kind of experience that most people did not, things that came to the door at night, uninvited, during October, and sat quietly in the moonlight, without any apparent urgency, were worth paying attention to. "Come in then," she said. The moth lifted from the doorstep and drifted past her into the warmth of the cottage. Maren closed the door behind it. When she turned, she saw that it had settled on the windowsill nearest the fire. The one where there were a dozen jars of various sizes stood all in a quiet row, all glowing their faint, remembered glow. The moth opened and closed its wings. Once, twice, then it was still. Maren sat down on her chair. She looked at the moth. The moth, or so it seemed to her, looked back. "You've come from somewhere," she said. She always spoke to things. It was a habit she had given up apologizing for. and you've brought something with you. The moth did nothing, of course. It was a moth. And yet Maren had the distinct and certain feeling, the kind of feeling that sat in the chest rather than in the head, that she was right. She went to bed that night with the moth still on the windowsill, faint wings folded, still as a secret. When she woke in the grey early morning, it was still there, and on the windowsill beside it, where nothing had been the night before, sat a small glass jar. Inside the jar, a single feather, dark at the base, pale at the tip, with a faint iridescence when the light touched it. Maren had never seen a feather quite that colour. She was not sure what bird it had come from. She was not sure it had come from a bird. She lifted the jar and held it to the window. In the grey morning light, the feather gave off no glow. It was too early for that, and perhaps too new. But she felt it anyway, the faint warmth of its remembering, vast and quiet and very old, like the memory of something that had happened long ago. It had passed into the body of the world itself. She put it on the shelf. She made tea. The moth was still there. Over the days that followed, Maren noticed small things. The moth did not eat, at least not that she saw, though she left a small dish of sugar water on the windowsill. And in the mornings it was always slightly less full. It did not seem to sleep, though sometimes when she woke at 3 or 4 in the morning, the cottage felt particularly still. She did have the sense that something was resting very deeply nearby. It moved through the cottage at night. She would sometimes see it drifting across the middle when she got up to add wood to the fire. But it always returned to the windowsill by morning, as though it were doing something in the dark hours, some quiet work that required the whole cottage and the whole night to accomplish. On the third night, she woke to find all the jars glowing at once, not faintly, brightly, a warm amber gold that lit the whole room, making every surface glow and casting the shadows in strange, beautiful directions. The moth sat in the centre of the windowsill, with its wings spread wide, and in the light of the glowing jars, it looked enormous and ancient and entirely unbothered. Maren sat up and looked around the room. She had the sense, very strongly, that the objects in the jars were not just remembering their owners tonight. They were telling each other, passing their small stories back and forth through the warm amber light. The button and the key and the drawing and the earring, all of them at once. Voices so quiet she couldn't hear them, but she could feel them. The way that you can feel a conversation in the next room, even with the door closed. She stayed very still and let it happen. When morning came, the glow was gone, and the moth was back on its windowsill, wings folded. Everything looked exactly as it always had, except on the shelf where she kept the newer jars. There were now 3 objects she had not put there. A small stone, oval, grey, green, smooth as water. A short length of red ribbon, tied in a bow, and then untied and retied again many times. A photograph, old, black and white, the edges soft, of a coastline she didn't recognise. All cliff and sky, and a sea the colour of iron. Lost things finding their way home. That is mostly the story. Not every story needs an ending, and this one certainly doesn't. Maren would tell you, if you asked her, that the best parts of most things happen in the in-between, in the long quiet, in the moments that aren't pushing toward anything. The moth stayed until the first frost. By then, there were 7 new jars on shelves, each containing something small and forgotten and quietly glowing in the evenings. Maren didn't know where they came from. She stopped wondering. On the last morning before the frost arrived, she woke to find the windowsill empty. The sugar dish was dry. The window was cold. Outside, the road was dark and the forest was dark, and above both of them, the stars were very bright, very still, going about their ancient business. She felt the absence of the moth, the way you feel the absence of a sound you have become so accustomed to that you had stopped hearing it, only noticing the silence when it returns. But the jars still glowed, and the feather in its jar, the very first object the moth had brought, still held its faint warmth when she held it to the light, still carried whatever it had carried from whatever distance. She stood at the window for a while, her tea growing cold in her hands. Then she went about her day. That evening, as the first frost settled across the road and the fields and the dark roof of the cottage, all the jars glowed a little brighter than usual. Not for long, just for a moment, as if saying good night. And Maren, sitting in her chair by the fire, watched them and felt not sadness, not exactly, more the particular sweetness of something that has been and mattered and passed. She fell asleep in her chair that night, and she slept very well. And so can you. Let the story settle around you like a warm room. You are safe. are held